Today, I'm going to do my absolute best to convince you not to start a podcast. Why is that? Well, because podcasts are a lie. Virtually every major podcasting anyone was already famous or already became successful on another platform or did something to become successful that had nothing to do with their podcast. And we're going to go into all that and more today. First off, as always, we're going to pop open a screen share. I have a lot of tabs open right now, but I want to show you some of the biggest podcasters in the space. I couldn't do a podcast video without first talking about Joe Rogan. Who am I and why do I have the authority to talk about all of this? Well, I've been a YouTube consultant for nearly a decade now. I've been behind the scenes working for brands. This is my first time making a YouTube channel and being a content creator, but I've worked with dozens of content creators over the years, and I know the ins and outs of how these systems work, so I'm trying to share with y'all my knowledge so that you can learn along with me. Joe Rogan, back to Joe Rogan. These thumbnails are terrible. They're some of the worst thumbnails ever. This bright green box thing looks terrible. No other channel could pull this off except for Joe Rogan. And why is that? Well, because Joe Rogan was a comedian for a number of years. He was on Fear Factor. He's a UFC announcer. So he was already famous when he started this podcast. And his podcast lightninged him to super fame because he was already famous, and then he started getting famous guests. When we look at his most popular videos, it has nothing to do with thumbnails or titles, which is normally what I talk about on this channel. It has everything to do with topics. It has everything to do with the guest that he picks. So Elon Musk, Edward Snowden, Alex Jones, these are all huge names. Kanye West, these are all huge names that people want to go and see. So what that tells me right away is that he's not doing a good job with his titles. He's not doing a good job with his thumbnails because it's not really breaking the mold. There is no no-name. There is no non-entity or non-famous person that's going to be in his most viewed videos. So it's because it's only famous people, you know, all of these topics of him talking about unique joke styles in the center of the world, they're never going to break through because he has an absolutely mega terrible thumbnail strategy. Is he doing some things right? Well, yeah, faces and use of faces, and you see his face in every video. It's also hyper consistent, right? We see him at the beginning of every video. So they do a lot right, but they also do way, way more wrong. So first off, while this is an incredibly popular podcast, it's a horrible example of how to become successful on YouTube or anywhere with your own podcast because you already have to be famous. No secret there. I just have to be a comedian for a number of years. Two Bears, One Cave, or YMH Studios, which is what it's become, is another example of the exact same thing. These two became popular. Bert Kreischer and Tom Segura became popular because they were comedians for a number of years. They went out in front of audiences all day, and now they have all these famous guests on. Their thumbnails are friggin' terrible because everybody's trying to copy Joe Rogan or Joe Rogan's style, and it does nothing for intrigue. It's just not interesting, and the only reason they're successful, again, is because they're famous. They've already built a brand around themselves. Ear Biscuits, it's the same problem. It's Rhett and Link. They're two incredibly famous YouTubers that had a wildly successful YouTube channel called Good Mythical Morning that grew for many years over time. Do you kind of get the point of what I'm trying to say here? Podcasts just don't work. Now, I actually do like Ear Biscuits' thumbnails a little more because at least they focus on faces and have these kind of fun, engaging backgrounds. The way they use their text is very intelligent, like it's not covering up the image, and they're not just repeating the title in the thumbnail text. So this is the best example so far of how to do a podcast channel, but again, these guys really only became popular because they were famous elsewhere. So we have to take everything that we've looked at so far with a grain of salt, but these guys have the best thumbnails that I've seen so far. The Vlogbrothers, not really a podcast. I was looking for Hank and John's podcast. I couldn't find it just on the short term, and this is meant to be a short video. Now we come to the real deal. This is Colin and Samir. I am a big fan of these guys, and not just because I like them, but because they do YouTube right. These thumbnails are outstanding. Why are they outstanding? Because they focus on a single face or two faces. They're hyper close-ups. They're really well oversaturated and very visual. And when you click on the beginning of these videos, you see those things. So here's deepfake Tom Cruise. We interviewed deepfake Tom Cruise. You see his face? Look what happens when I hover over. There's his face. Doug DeMuro. Doug DeMuro, even though we don't really see his name in the title, we do see it in the thumbnail, and there it is, right? And then we see, oh, boom, he's right there in the studio talking to them. This is how you do thumbnails, folks. And even though Joe Rogan is incredibly popular, if he changed his thumbnail style, he'd be getting way more views than he is now. I can say the exact same thing of Ear Biscuits, where they should be having guests on, quite frankly, or Bert and Tom, with their Two Bears, One Cave podcast, and Bert with his regular podcast. None of them are doing thumbnails like this. None of them are doing styles like this. Colin and Samir, they're breakout stars. They were not super famous before they did this YouTube channel. They just made great content and people came to watch it. So that's why they are a much better example and a channel to model after, because they are like you and I. They're not famous comedians. They're not, radio talk show hosts. They organically started a channel that became successful, and as a result, they're a good one for you and I to model after because they did the work. They weren't just given a channel and got views. They had to do the work. And not just in getting guests, but in making engaging content the right way. So this is the channel to look at if you're trying to figure out how to do thumbnails. And by the way, Colin and Samir do a lot of content that is actually not podcast content. Their podcasts are edited for sure, and they figured out a way to be engaging. We spent 24 hours with Mr. Beast is not a podcast, right? Nobody's sitting in front of a microphone there, although sort of they are. You have to watch the video to understand what I mean. But there's a lot of content on here that's really not podcast content. And that's how these guys were able to break through all the noise, is by making engaging content and also doing a podcast that was consistently on the channel throughout the page. So that brings me to my final point. The one channel we looked at today that I love that's doing it right doesn't just do podcast content, they do other content. So if you want to become a successful podcast, you really need to be a successful content creator first, and then a successful podcast creator second. You need to think about the visual elements of your podcast, because the fact of the matter is, discovery of audio-only podcasts is miserably low. Having a visual element and posting on platforms that are visual, that get way more engagement and way more views, is the right way to go. So if you're wondering how to start a podcast channel, the irony of what I'm about to say is not lost on me. You really have to be a content creator. You have to make videos first. That's what it takes. Or you need to introduce a video element to your podcast. Critical Role, they did visual elements for years before they became a podcast, and now everybody talks about them as a podcast. But they aren't really a podcast. They're visual, right? Visual stuff, not just audio. So that's the secret, and the secret really isn't a secret. It's kind of disappointing, which is, if you want to start a podcast channel, you got to make video content, and you got to make a lot of it, and you got to make good video content, which is what this channel is all about, baby. So if you learned something today, I hope you did, and if you didn't, hit me up in the comments. But if you did enjoy this, subscribe to the video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to hear from you soon. All right, thanks everybody. Bye.